Hello, you're watching Talk On, the podcast of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Germany. My name is Christoph Brumann.
And I'm Jovan Maud. And in this podcast, we're going to be talking about current research and debates in the field of social anthropology.
Hey everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Talk On. As a surprise, you can probably tell that I am neither Jovan nor Christoph. My name is Xenia Cherkaev, and I am hosting today's episode with our guest, Alice von Bieberstein, who teaches at Humboldt University at the Department for European Ethnology. And we are here today to talk about her new book, Temptations in Ruin, Sovereign Accumulation and the Making of Post-Genocide Turkey, which just came out a month ago, 2 months ago?
Yeah.
2 months ago, with University of Pennsylvania Press. So welcome, Alice.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming. So I want to start with the title, actually. It's called Temptations in Ruin. And again, I just think it's a cool title and a nice cover. And that can be read many ways. I mean, so, you know, it can be like the ruin of temptation, like there was temptation and now it is ruined. It can be, I am tempted to do something in the midst of ruins. Could you speak to the title and maybe a little bit about how you came to the project as well?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the reason for choosing that title was about playing and capturing the ambivalence that I kind of found in the ethnographic fieldwork and through the analysis. As a background, the book is the result of an ERC-funded research project called Remnants, Living with Remnants. And I kind of ended up in a place called Muş, which is a city as well as a province in Far Eastern Turkey, which is also known as Northern Kurdistan or Western Armenia. And these names already point to this complicated kind of history of territorialization. And I ended up there sort of more by serendipity, by planning. That's another story. But my research coincided with an urban reconstruction project that targeted the old part of the town. So there was a historical quarter with buildings, several hundred years old. And in 2012, the municipality of the city of Muş, together with Turkey's public housing authority called TOKİ, they decided to launch a urban reconstruction project and thereby demolish this stock of historical buildings. And very likely this is, from what we can tell, also where the historically Armenian quarters of the city were. So important to know that Muş and this region is part of the historical heartland of Armenia. And in the plain, the population was about 80% Armenian. In the city, they were actually in the minority, but constituted the main productive force of the city. So I witnessed, on the one hand, this urban reconstruction project, as well as in its aftermath, how people were not only kind of, benefiting from liquidating and selling all kinds of building materials that they could salvage from the demolition process, but also in the aftermath, after the houses were sort of torn apart, people went on to dig in the foundations in the search of what is locally known as Armenian gold or Armenian treasures. And there is this sort of widespread obsession in the area, or a kind of fantasy belief that Armenians buried their valuables before being deported in 1915, before being killed. It's, not really clear, but that was part of the scene. And then I also became friends with a family that ended up kind of fighting against the dispossession, demolition of their house. And they did so through a process of kind of getting it listed as a heritage. So there is this the whole urban landscape has been demolished, and there's just this, and these kind of large buildings have been erected, but there's like one house standing. And so I was really struck how the remnants of this historically Armenian landscape in the form of at sort of different scales, from the quarter in total to the individual house to the, these mythical, phantasmatic objects that are lying buried beneath the ground, how all of these are become imbued with some force of attraction, and people are tempted to, which is already a ruined landscape because it's 100 years of not just post-genocide kind of abandonment and dissolution, but also targeted destruction in the context of sort of genocide denial, which needs to kind of erase all of these traces as well. So there's a landscape that is in ruin, and people are tempted by these ruins, but they also are tempted out of a position of, destitution and utter impoverishment, because this is one of the poorest areas in Turkey. And, particularly when it comes to this, that I mentioned, this practice of treasure hunting, it also ruins people economically, financially, because people get obsessed with...
And they invest all their resources in looking for this gold, which is...
Yes, so they have to invest a lot of resources, whatever, rent cars, buy equipment, and sort of, invest in this idea that they might find something big in the future, but basically it ruins the families in the present. So I was trying to capture, this sort of ambivalence and layeredness of interesting of that relation between differently positioned kind of people and this landscape.
So there's what you just said, there's a lot of accumulation going on variously, right? So there's people looking for gold, whether or not they find it, the treasures, there's the guy with the house, but none of it struck me as particularly sovereign, and yet I'll hold up the book again, the first word of the subtitle is sovereign accumulation in the Making of Post-Genocide Turkey. So I wanted to ask you, and within the book, sovereign, I mean, I did read the book. I didn't just read the title. I know it sounds like I just read the title. Sovereign accumulation is a major concept. And I personally found it quite productive, actually, also for the work that I do in Russia. And so I was hoping that you could unpack it for us. And I wanted to maybe ask you to start historically. You bring it back to the Armenian genocide and abandoned property. Could you speak to that?
Yes. So similarly to the title, I mean, the sort of sovereign accumulation term is multidimensional in itself. But yeah, the history of the Armenian genocide really plays a central role in it. And at some level, the book is also about, when we place it in the discussions of the history of Turkey and the historiography of Turkey, it's also about recentering the Armenian genocide really as a significant event of mass violence in the longer history of the development of capitalism in Turkey in the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Republican nation state. Because in a lot of the literature on sort of Turkey's modernity or in the history of capitalism, basically Armenian genocide is not mentioned. It's like, it doesn't feature. But, in a sort of post-Marxist whatever vein, I think that actually this, the role of violence needs to be conceptually foregrounded. So I build very much on the work of historians of the late Ottoman period and of the Armenian genocide that have basically done really invaluable work in showing how the genocide was, not just a program of mass murder, but also really a moment of primitive accumulation and mass dispossession. So the late Ottoman Empire and the government, the so-called Committee for Union in Progress, not only deported the population, the Armenian population, to what is now the Syrian desert, but they also set up these commissions for abandoned properties throughout the empire with a task to kind of record the values of all the assets, both movable and immovable assets of the deported population, and then finally to liquidate them. And they did so actually without ever suspending the rights, the private property rights of the deported population,
That's
which
fascinating.
distinct as well, and we don't have that in the Holocaust, for instance. So they were kind of setting up accounts in the name of the people being deported, or at least of the locations if they didn't know the people, and recorded the values in their names, and so have these account books, and basically positing the state as the steward of these values. And all, but effectively still realizing a program of mass redistribution with a view and effectively with the consequence of bringing into being a Muslim capitalist class. Because throughout the 19th century, there was a long policy of liberalization, and it was really a lot of non-Muslims that had benefited from this economic liberalization. They were often, as I mentioned, the sort of productive forces in the cities. They were often at the forefront of capitalist modernization. There were also a lot of poor peasants. So this is not to say that they were like, just the bourgeoisie, but they were part of this modernization process. So part of the what I'm doing is also to trace how over the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Republic nation state with the Armenian genocide really as the core event, that we can see the emergence of a kind of racialized property regime that excluded non-Muslims from entitlement to land and property for the time to come. So we have other kind of later episodes that fit into that, maybe the wealth tax and other things that were happening at a later point. But so what we see is really also then a kind of different genealogy of the relation between state, capital, and private property, from sort of more classic Marxist developmentalist frames that would, see the introduction of private property regimes as, part of the emergence of the bourgeois nation state. That it protects the interests of the bourgeoisie, and that it, goes hand in hand with sort of mass enclosures, proletarianization, et cetera. But here what we see is not this sort of transition from, multiple rights to commons to then exclusive private, property rights, but really more a transition, from the sort of multi-ethnic to the sort of racialization and that kind of history of master's possession. So really how the introduction of private property is really tied very closely to this history of political violence against non-Muslims.
Is it that the state stewards this private property that kind of remains private but is now being stewarded by the state, but kind of proper citizens get to use it?
Those who can use it are basically are those, through this sort of role of stewardship, the state also manages to homogenize the population because it declares that only those it deems Muslim Turks or Kurds then have a right to
use this property.
Exactly, to use this property. Yeah, the whole question of why non-Muslims were officially not, how can I say, how their right to private property was not officially suspended is also an interesting story. The point is really this kind of the homogenization and the through the exclusion of non-Muslims from property.
So let's come back to the present though, because the book is a historical ethnography, or it's yes or no,
historically informed
ethnography, and it is written in the 2010s. That's where you did the work. In the Kurdish area, as you said, of Turkey. So how does this history of sovereign accumulation then inform the relations that you spoke about?
Yeah, totally. So I was really struck. I think what struck me, maybe not so much while doing the research, but then, coming back, doing, again, a lot more reading about 1915 and the specificity of that process of dispossession and redistribution. I was really struck by, not just that sort of, often we talk, the how the history sort of manifests in the present and it sort of leaves these traces and, we have to historically contextualize. But no, I was really struck by how the Armenian genocide in the specificity as a moment of primitive accumulation is actually reanimated in the present. Like it's not just that it affects the present, but there is a, that's why I talk a lot about sort of the recursivity of it. So one is by, as I said, by seeing, by the temptations, by realizing how these Armenian material remains, whether it is at the level of the neighborhood at large, whether it's at the level of individual buildings or these ephemeral kind of fleeting objects that are gold and treasures underground, how all of them exude this promise of wealth. So there is really this like incredible return of 1915 as, these are materials that we can make money of, that we can benefit from, but also in its specificity. So the book is kind of structured around these differently positioned actors, so the municipality and the social housing authority. Then it is, the treasure hunters. It is Ercan, this man and his family that are protecting their house, who has been politicized and socialized with the Kurdish freedom movement. So that is a political force. Then there is a chapter on the descendants of Armenian survivors. We have to know that in 1915, in this area in particular, a lot of children and young women were able to physically survive because they were taken into Muslim families, but were thoroughly, at the price of a complete sort of, they had to let go of their identity of birth. So their names, their language, their religion, everything. So they were completely Islamized. But because of a sort of patrilineal logic, there are still people who are named or who self-identify now as Armenian because they basically descend from these children and young women that survived. So this is, and then in the epilogue, I look at Armenians that come for visit, as pilgrims or tourists. And I was really struck by how, the different ways that people relate and claim and target and kind of try and like capture or extract value from this landscape, from this, material landscape, really reflects precisely the sort of racialized proper regime and the positionalities that came into being and were formed around 1915. For instance, the Armenian visitors, they would never even dream of kind of reclaiming the property because it's very clear that this is out of the question. So they just, take soil and like whatever, some stones. A good illustration is also these descendants of survivors who came together to form an association and were really dreaming, also just dreaming of caring for the church ruin or for certain, ruinous structures without ever, again, articulating a desire or daring to sort of claim to reappropriate, to sort of come in possession again. So we see these very different things. So that's what struck me, that really we see the sort of particularity of that structure at work. But also how, and coming back to this idea of the promise of wealth, how in that moment, kind of history almost became like, or not almost, and this is what I'm saying in the book, becomes itself a kind of necropolitical or necro-economic frontier of sorts, like in the sense that, it follows, really extractivist logics, but not in the sense that the underground, what we usually associate with extractivism is that, there are these resources like underground and we appropriate them and they're like this constitutive outside of capitalism and, capitalism can appropriate these values that it's not helping in generating, but just appropriating. But here it's really the underground as a historical formation. And I speak of this like as a historia nullius, as a kind of like the frontier land that we can kind of reappropriate. So really about like, how 100 years later, people are tempted by this landscape and sort of by the enduring promise to generate wealth out of this ruinous landscape. So how sovereign violence really returns. So this is the other dimension of sovereign accumulation, how in the ethnographic present, that ethnographic that sovereign violence can be reanimated and brought into the present.
It seems like it can be sort of privatized in a way. Since the state guarantees value in this kind of, violent historical, in this violent way in the past, it seems that people can sort of tap into that regime.
Exactly,
No way.
and it of course it continues to be part of the citizenship regime as well, and this kind of long history exactly of sharing in the loot, so to speak, you know, and then that it's also that original kind of social contract, if you will, or that promise, you know, like, okay, we share in this, and this is precisely when particularly evident when we look at treasure hunting, which is officially, of course, illegal, but tacitly tolerated by the authorities because, you know, particularly in the context of the urban regeneration process, which involved mass indebting, you know, the local population. I mean, you take away their houses. A lot of them were given an additional debt because the houses, you know, that they were promised in return was more valuable than these derelict old historical buildings. So, you know, when people then went on to dig the foundations and searched for treasures, you know, the state was like, okay, we let this happen because, it's like an ongoing kind of contract of complicity in this sovereign violence.
So how important is it that this story takes place in Kurdistan? Because there's this sort of the Armenian violence against the Armenians, right, is one sort of major line running through the book. The other one, though, is political relations with the state from the point of view of the Kurdish population. I mean, friends of yours are in prison. You mentioned this in the book. And this, I mean, it seems that this political struggle really influenced the ethnography, at least. What's the relationship between the political struggle and sovereign accumulation?
So, yes, the research, again, it wasn't planned that way, but coincided with the previous episode of what, you know, there are these recurrent moments of a peace process, trying to resolve the struggle, resolve the Kurdish issue, problem, whatever, how the state names it. It was really a moment, you know, when a lot of local talk politics was about, this peace process, about, you know, the struggle for self-determination, autonomy, survival. Because, of course, the way that this region has been governed over the course of the 20th century plays a central role in the book as well. And it really is that after the foundation of the Republic, the state quickly turned its sort of war machine, if we will, against the Kurdish population, particularly in the context of sort of some insurgencies and rebellions that were taking place in the early period of the Republic. So really the long 20th century and up until today, this region is subject to policies of subjection and pacification. It's been governed through multiple different forms of sort of states of exception, martial law, war, and also economic policies have been made subservient to this sort of these military imperatives, if you will, by, you know, sometimes there's like trying to integrate, but mostly it's a lot of abandonment and impoverishment. And of course, this plays, first of all, a role in the force of temptation and in the kind of that I just talked about, these also moments of complicity or tacit sort of collaborations that then take shape. And yes, so the Kurdish freedom movement associated with the PKK is a very strong political force in the region, and is now, you know, is regularly sending also, the pro-Kurdish party sends its MPs from Mush to the parliament. And in generally, they have pursued, of course, a much more progressive politics of history and memory, also with a view towards other minorities, including non-Muslim minorities. So, and there's also sort of a discourse around, you know, brotherhood and solidarity of all oppressed people, and a kind of, you know, we've both been subject to the state sovereign machine violence, so we need to kind of, you know, join forces. But at the same time, I think the book is, and while it acknowledges that, and it also makes an appearance, particular through Ercan's struggle for his house. I mean, I mentioned before that he's been politicized through the movement, and I think that plays a very important role in informing his struggle to defend his house and his entire politics. So it's very much present. But there's also this, I think the book is a little bit also a question, you know, to Kurdish politics around, I mean, that has also been debated within, you know, the Kurdish sort of intellectual scene. Like, I mean, the question of complicity in the Armenian genocide, because Kurds partook in the violence. they didn't decide it, but they kind of took over land, they partook in the killings, So it really is, but it's also a question in some sense to, it's also a political question in a way to what it means to inhabit and settle and like continue to live on this land. So it's really a kind of land question that is posed also to the Kurdish movement, which reaches beyond just the question of sort of political recognition and acknowledging the genocide and commemorating the genocide, but like how do we tackle this question of land and maybe reparations or returns, which is something that we have in other contexts of genocide or settler colonialism or something like this, So
well,
this
and
land question.
It seems that how we continue to live on this land, but also how we continue to live in this value regime, because on one hand is like politics, and on the other hand there is value, and value is guaranteed by the state and this regime of sovereign accumulation, in which what I found really interesting about the book, or in the book, is that it seems that, I know you said that recursivity for you has to do with the way history becomes itself terra nullius, but I think it also works in this other way where people can claim stewardship as a way of resistance. Without, which you mentioned earlier, right? In one of the things you said, where this association of Islamicized Armenians, right? They have this dream of stewarding the material remains without claiming to appropriate them, reappropriate them. That's off the question, but that's off the table. But stewardship is not. And so there is this interesting way that people can sort of work within this value regime, but also that seems to me, at least, to mean that there is no outside of this value regime, since it's guaranteed by the state. You see?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, it's something that historically struck me that, in 1915, as I mentioned before, the state kind of positioned itself as the sort of steward of the values of Armenian material and immaterial or movable and immovable assets. And then, yes, I also look at these two cases. So one is the house that I mentioned, Ercan's house. So Ercan was really the only person, or his family, Hajar and their children, they were the only family that resisted the dispossession and demolition of their house in the context of this urban regeneration scheme. And it was very much driven by a sense of, this is injustice. Like, they cannot just take my house away. Like, who are they? Like, but he also knew that if he went to go to court to defend his right to private property, the state would overrule this because emergency legislation, because of executive powers of the municipality, whatever. So he knew this was, he was not going to win that struggle. So he went and kind of fought to have it listed as a heritage site, which is a very interesting thing. And in that, there's really this ambivalence. Sort of on the one hand, it was about defending his right to private property. But it was also always he was also always mobilizing this discourse that it's really a historical artifact and it needs to be protected. It also needs to be protected because these Armenian tourists or pilgrims or visitors keep walking through the quarter on their way to the church ruin. They pass by his house, they take pictures, they have chats. And, he sees them cry, and he has, he acknowledges that they have a connection to this land. And he's like, these things shouldn't disappear because obviously they are also of value, of an emotional, symbolical, whatever, historical value to these people that are walking past. So this kind of animated his politics, on the one hand. But again, we see the sort of interconnection between it was not to be disentangled, like the idea that this is private property, but it's also valuable to these people. So I can, and actually against the sort of sovereign accumulation regime of the state, even maybe contradictorily, holding onto the private property was a way of sharing it actually with the historical victims, and actually being then a steward, because the state would not be a steward, so to speak. He could be a steward, but actually, for the benefit of also the descendants of survivors on visit. And the other case is precisely this association of Armenians that was formed in 2014 in the area, and their dreams of caring, but again from a position of exclusion, because as I mentioned, they could not articulate that they would reclaim and actually repossess these sites, but they articulate, we will be caretakers, we will be takers. But in both cases also, and I think that's relevant, and as you said, it's not outside of the value regime. It's also not the other of extraction. It's not just, it's really not a kind of pure space of whatever, generous generosity for authority or whatever. Like it's really because in both cases it was also always entangled with ideas that maybe, I mean, either to retain the property or to also benefit from it. One could develop it. One could, also benefit from the tourism, from the kind of what's locally called faith tourism, that people come and maybe we could open a cafe and we can also make money from it, So it's never kind of completely disentangled, but it is, of course, still figuring a different kind of relationship, at least to the visitors, than one of complete sort of exclusion and violent targeting.
So at one point, you have this really beautiful phrase in the book. You say, when you're describing sovereign accumulation, the concept, you say that it's an illiberal undercurrent in the history of accumulation. And I was wondering, I mean, is that specific to Turkey? Because in a way, and you keep talking about, the historical, I mean, for your book, certainly the historical narrative is a very important one. But in other ways, I actually see this concept very applicable to other cases I know. Like, I work in Russia, and I mean, it's a different history. The state got rid of, the Soviet state got rid of private property completely, but it is certainly a state-led value regime also. And in a way, I mean, there's all this talk now that we're living in neo-feudalism and all of this. I mean, does the concept of sovereign accumulation, does it speak sort of more broadly to our like late liberal, illiberal moment globally?
Oh, I hope so. I mean, we do see for sure a kind of, resurgence of mercantilist politics, certainly. I mean, right now, trade tariffs and all of these kind of transformations we're observing. And yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned, what struck me was the kind of different history of the introduction of private property in the late Ottoman Empire, and the different sort of role and how it connects to political violence, and to the state's kind of role in guaranteeing certain value regimes. And and I think that, I mean, on the one hand, it's interesting that Armenians weren't, as I mentioned before, that they weren't excluded. I mean, their right to private property was officially not suspended. I think part of the book is about opening up the global archive of these relations between state capital and the role of private property and violence. And it's a particular kind of genealogy and a particular constellation that we see here. So what really caught my attention is when we place this episode, in the broader kind of global archive of dispossessing what might be called indigenous people, and that's something that is now circulating as well. Calling Armenians, one of the indigenous people of Anatolia. In general, in other kind of settler colonial contexts and in literature, the dispossession is contingent upon a process of racialization that casts those dispossessed out of the realm of a liberal humanity. So liberal humanity in the sense of, those capable of, having a conception of property and being able to hold property. And kind of, casting the indigenous, the natives, whatever, out of that realm of the human was always one of the legitimating forces, enabling their dispossession and the theft. And we don't have that in the case of the Armenians, they didn't, and that really struck me. And I was like, why is that the case? And the only kind of possible conclusion that I could come to is that because liberalism was not really what was at stake. I mean, there was no need to cast these Armenians out of this liberal humanity, because it was not a liberal project to start with, so to speak. I think this is what I'm getting at in a way. And this is where I'm thinking, okay, these might be interesting. Yeah, the sort of illiberal undercurrents that, might resonate, as you say, hopefully, maybe with other scholars and with other kind of places and sites and what people are struggling to make sense of today.
So with the illiberal undercurrent being our, historical situation globally, does this book tie into your new projects? I know I've heard you talk about financialization. Is it? Can you speak to your next project?
Yeah. So one thing that I was left with really was this. I keep on being struck by the fact that the sort of these Armenians in some sense, retained a ghostly present in these account books, if you will. You know, like you kill them, but I mean, you kill the bodies, but you retain them as property holders. That strikes me as really
It's fascinating.
crazy.
It's completely fascinating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's something that really and led me to think that I would like to, I mean, I'm really just in the process of conceptualizing this, but to work actually on the financial history and the financial afterlives of the genocide. Amongst them, for instance, and what is fascinating is that the only asset that the Ottoman government could not get their hands on in 1915 were life insurances that had been sold and bought by Armenians in the Ottoman Empire from foreign companies such as Union Vie in Paris or New York Life that had been, the companies that started selling these life insurances in the late 19th century. And in the early 2000s, there was an Armenian-American lawyer in California that was able to launch 2 class action lawsuits against AXA, the successor of Union Vie, and New York Life in California. So I'm really, part of this really led me to think that I would like to dig deeper into finance and its, particular temporalities and what it allows, and particularly in the context where the genocide continues to be denied and all the public state archives are are not accessible to researchers. What about these commercial archives? What about, all of these like financial products that were being sold, and what happened to these values and to these relations and to these temporalities across the divide that the genocide is, and how might they be thought of also as sites for, contemporary struggles and reparations and these kind of questions. But I'm really in the early kind of, just mainly fascinated and thinking about it.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
That sounds amazing. Okay, well, I really look forward to your next project. Please, people joining us, please read the book if you have not yet. Find it in your local library or buy it, although it's only out in hardcover, unfortunately. Alice, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Xenia.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We're coming to you from Halle, Germany. This has been Talk On. Please tune in for the next podcast.